to look the part, I left my beard at home. So I'm going to read a piece. This is an excerpt from a longer piece I write, so hopefully it makes sense without the context, but I'm not promising anything. It's the cold that wakes him sometime after nightfall. Alarm bells screaming somewhere in the back of his head as, too weak from blood loss to even shiver successfully, his body temperature begins to plummet. That's always been a vulnerability of his. Smaller surface area to mass ratio, he loses heat faster than a larger man would. The perforated muscles in his side have stiffened painfully while he slept. He presses a hand against the wound to ground himself. The temptation to drift off back to sleep is overwhelming, but he can't risk it. Odds are he wouldn't wake up again. A few hours pass in the still of the pungent dark, and he concentrates on just breathing as he slowly attempts to scrape together the mental and physical resources to move. At one point, a lumbering land vehicle painted with local law enforcement's crest trundles slowly by, a blinding searchlight probing the darkness of the alley. He forces himself to hold still and let the light pass over him, face pressed into his knees, giving every impression of unconcerned slumber. They're looking for someone to panic, to bolt. They aren't going to pay any attention to one more sleeping vagrant unless he gives them a reason to. In the end, from somewhere he finds the reserves of strength to slowly climb to his feet, using the wall for support. The movement is enough to send a fresh pulse of hot blood soaking into the already saturated bandage tightly wrapped under his stolen shirt. A small, weak pulse by this stage. There's not all that much left in him to lose. Fuck, he needs something to eat, much as the thought turns his stomach. Water too. He needs to start replacing the horrific amount of blood he's lost. Moving slowly and carefully through the nighttime streets, he devotes his effort for the next couple of hours to a little petty theft. He does pick up some food and water in the end, along with fresh clothes, which while neither to his taste nor entirely clean, or at least not soaked in his own blood. And most critically of all, he also manages to acquire some actual medical supplies, complete with actual disinfectant which doesn't come in the form of cheap whiskey. That's more than he dared to hope for. It's the first scrap of luck he's had since he got shot. It takes him another hour to find a quiet corner in which he can patch himself up, and he has to play dead for the patrols twice in a time. In the end, he eats first. The food sticks in his dry throat, sets his stomach to roiling unpleasantly, but he knows he needs to. If he tries to sew himself up without putting something back in his body after all it's lost, he is going to pass out. He can't risk that right now. He forces down every last scrap, easing the way with the water, and gives it a few moments to settle before he starts in with the medical supplies. The exit window is far enough around on his side that he can't really see it nor reach it easily. His hands are steady even now, but still his stitches are a far cry from the neat even rows he usually manages. Messy as they are, though, they do the job that's required of them, and there's something grounding in the bite of the needle and the tug of surgical thread through torn flesh. It's familiar. He's done this for himself a dozen times, and with every stitch he closes, something settles back into place in his chest. He knows how to do this. He's going to put himself back together, and he's going to get the fuck out of here somehow, and he's going to survive. He tears the old shirt into strips for fresh bandages and uses the last of the water dosed with the last of the antiseptic to wash the blood from his skin, before pulling on the new one. And then he makes his slow way back to the cluster of tarps and lean-tos which indicate a favoured location of the local homeless community, and finds a friendly fire to stave off hypothermia while the food works its way through enough to make a difference. He makes up some story. Coming up from south of the capital, tracking down some family for a place to stay while he gets back on his feet. He's never been there, but he's heard variations on the theme enough to make it convincing. He picks up some advice on safe places to sleep, on where to scrounge up some food, on where to beg. He doesn't take any of it at face value, but he does file it away as potentially useful. There's not much left of the night by this point. He spends it by the fire, huddled into the recesses of his stolen jacket, soaking up as much heat as he can, while his body starts to replace the lost blood, starts to heal. From hard-earned experience, he knows it'll be a day and a half before the dizziness fades, and more than a week before he can really fight without tearing the window open again. Shortly before dawn, he starts shivering. That's reassuring. It's a step in the right direction, at least. He stays by the fire until morning, until it starts to die down and as people begin to move off to beg or steal or whatever it is they do with their days. The shivering subsides eventually. He still feels slightly like death, but his head is clearer, and he's now reasonably confident of surviving the next couple of hours without having to claw back every minute. He checked his stitches with light, cautious fingertips. They're holding. There hasn't been any fresh bleeding. Of course, with surviving the next 5 minutes no longer his sole driving impulse, this has the unfortunate side effect of leaving him with enough space to consider his next move. Not so very long ago, that wouldn't even have been a question. Not so very long ago, he would already have been plotting the quickest and most efficient way to steal a fast ship and get himself the fuck off this rock. It would have been simple, if not easy. Now, for the first time that he can remember, he finds himself torn. There's a flicker of an impulse to head back to the rendezvous point. He ignores it. It's too close to the present to risk for now, not in the state he's currently in, and frankly, after yesterday, there's no reason to believe that there will be anything waiting for him when he gets there. He tells himself that there are any number of reasons why the others might have missed the rendezvous, and speculating on what those reasons might be is worse than useless in his present situation. There's no point in dwelling on it. He spends the day drifting around the capital at a cautious walk, getting his bearings and scoping for a bolt hole, for resources, for anything he can use. The sky is clear and the sun merciless overhead, the air hot and breathless around him, and his attention ends up mostly split between casually evading patrols and finding enough to eat and drink not to unnecessarily slow the healing process. He does at least manage to pick up some local currency through a combination of petty theft and the odd charitable passer-by, throwing coins at his feet on the occasions where he has to stop and pretend to be a beggar to avoid the attention of the cops. That's one of the most useful lessons he's ever learned. There's no one so invisible as the poor bastard asking you for money. The day passes, the sun sets, and the uncomfortable flush of heat doesn't fade, instead intensifying and bringing a splitting headache with it. And the bottom drops out of his stomach as he realises that he was too late with the antiseptic. The gunshot wound's infected. He heads back to the fire he'd spent the last night by for utter lack of any better options. He huddles as close by as he can get away with, pale and shaking and drenched in cold sweat, ignoring the wary and faintly pitying glances from the other denizens of this particular alleyway, who almost certainly think he's on drugs by now. Not that he cares. They're welcome to think whatever the fuck they like that stops them noticing the bullet hole in his side and starting to ask awkward questions. He doesn't manage to move the next morning. He does manage not to throw up, which under the circumstances is counting as a win. He can't afford to lose any more fluids than he already has, and neither his cracked ribs nor his shaky stitches could fucking take it right now. He survived worse, he reminds himself, when he's not too busy cursing his own fucking stupidity for suggesting this plan in the first place. At this stage, he doesn't have much choice but to write it out. Sometime in the early afternoon, he plants himself on the main street and does a little genuine begging, which isn't exactly his preferred option, but he needs to fucking eat, and his usual approach of stealing is off the table right now, given just how badly he can't afford getting arrested again. This way, all he has to achieve is striking the correct balance between looking pathetic enough to get petty money, not difficult, and not looking so pathetic that some well-meaning idiot calls emergency services, more difficult. The worst of the fever seems to pass after the first day, which he sincerely hopes means that he's healing rather than he's actually dying. The entry wound has oozed a small amount of horrific pus, a sickly shade of yellow not found in nature, laced with blood. But the stitches have held. He cleans it off as best he can and doesn't waste time wishing he'd kept back more of the antiseptic. A little moonshine acquired from a generous, and by generous he means unconscious, fellow alley dweller, serves the purpose just as well. He sleeps near the fire again that night, light and restless with his back against the wall, and when dawn comes he forces himself to climb to his feet and move off, and return to slightly less petty theft and now with more of a plan in mind. He's not assuming the ship's coming back for him. He's far too cynical for that. He's also not assuming they've just left him for dead. Fuck, they've earned that much over the last few months, but it's been 3 days now since they missed a rendezvous without a whisper of contact. There's no terribly compelling reason for them to be assuming he's still alive, and no way for them to find him if they foolishly are regardless. So he's going to plan for having to find a way off this fucking planet by himself. But that doesn't mean he can't also make it a little easier for them to find him on the off chance they are still looking. He's still sick and feverish and kind of concerned that he might actually be dying, but the last few days have at least given his body time to replenish the lost blood, to start him on the road to healing. It's enough to keep him going. He's nothing if not stubborn, and he doesn't have it in him to stop fighting and survive for others so much as to think his ghost of a chance. He chooses his moment, and when the opportunity arises, he quietly lets himself into the back room of a small electronics store and liberates a few choice components. He might be a fucking mess right now, but he's still him. Making something useful out of nothing is what he does. It's not much. Just a short-range beacon pulsing a steady signal tuned to the ship's comm frequency. It's basic, you can't risk a message, not when law enforcement are bound to be watching for any unusual chatter. But if they're still looking, it'll be enough. If. And if not, well, it's small enough to carry easily in a pocket and forget about while he scopes out the docking cradles for a plan B.